Hey, thanks for tuning in today. So for today's episode, we're gonna make dinner out of some pantry staples. Really a pasta, really any kind of pasta will work, any pasta noodle. And we're gonna be doing it with a butternut squash. These are really shelf stable. They can last on your counter for a long time or your pantry for a long time. And they go great with a brown butter sauce. Check it out. So looking around the pantry today, I found a butternut squash that had been sitting there for a couple weeks, so we're going to be using that tonight. And we're going to be making a pasta out of it. So I grabbed some spaghetti from the pantry and had some butter in the fridge, had some herbs, some spices, and some olive oil. So we're going to kind of throw that together and see what we come up with. First thing we want to do is lay out all of our components. So we've got our squash, like I said, we've got our pasta. I've also gone ahead and gotten the salt and pepper. I always want to make sure that I'm using kosher salt and not just like a table salt when I do this. This is going to have some sage in it. Sage is a great pairing for butternut squash, and it's also going to be cooked in some brown butter. So I've got some good unsalted butter. You do want to make sure it's unsalted. If it's not unsalted, then you're going to add a little less salt as you go. So I want to begin by prepping the squash. So I've already washed this, and I'm simply going to take my vegetable peeler, move this over a little bit, and what I'm going to do is just kind of do some quick peeling around the edges of the squash. As I do this, it's going to expose any areas that I might need to cut off. So there's an area that's a little spoiled. I'm just going to go ahead and peel all the way around it. Once I've made it all the way around, then I'm going to start just peeling the bottom half using these kind of motions. Once you get the bottom half mostly peeled, you're going to see there's a couple different layers to the butternut squash. There's kind of a light yellow layer at first, and then there's a darker orange layer, and that's fine all the way. But you do want to make sure you get all of this skin off. There are many vegetables that you want to keep the skin on for the nutrients, not the butternut squash. This skin is just too thick. Wouldn't cook down as well with a particular dish that we're making. So we're going to go ahead and get that off. Once you have it down about that far, you move to the top. It can get kind of slippery, so keep a good grip on it. And you just do another row of peeling. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. I do want to mention while I'm doing this that I'm going to be saving all of these scraps. So before you just kind of pitch these scraps, think about maybe composting them in your garden or in your compost bin. Think about maybe using them for stock. I wouldn't really use these peels for stock, but if I had onion or carrots or celery, I might save that. Lots of things you can do with your vegetable scraps. So once I've got this peeled, I'm going to go ahead and trim off the top and trim off the bottom. So I'm going to move my cutting board over so you can get a view of this. I've got my knife. It's really important to have a sharp chef's knife. You want one that is sharp because you're actually less likely hurting yourself. And you also want to practice good knife safety and also sanitation. So I washed my hands, I washed the vegetable, clean knife, so on. I also want to point out that this cutting board is for vegetables only. If I was using any kind of meat, I would use one of my plastic cutting boards. So I very simply cut through, and I'm going to go ahead and cut off the top. So now it can sit nice and easy on a flat surface. At this point, I'm actually going to be separating the squash right down the center into two halves. And when I do that, you're going to see, just like in a pumpkin, a center area that will actually need to be scooped out. And scoop into the center, removing all of this. You can kind of hold it in close to you so you don't accidentally take off more than you want. And as you work your spoon around, the entire section should begin making its way off. You've got a few stray seeds in there. I always do another round of scraping just to make sure I've got all the main components out of the butternut squash. And there we have it. What I like to do when I cut the butternut squash, if you see there's the bottom part we scooped out and then there's this top kind of solid section, I like to turn it flat and then cut this top section free. Now what I do is I take this and I cut it into strips. And the reason I'm cutting it into strips is because we're going to want the butternut squash to be cubed. And we don't want these cubes to be too large because they have to cook down in a reasonable time when we actually make our pasta. So once I get this cut, I'm going to go ahead and cut it into strips. like so. And then I'm going to take the strips, turn them, and I'm going to cut them, carefully going along, making sure not to cut myself in the process, and so on. So now I'm left with this piece. I find the easiest way to cut this one is to turn it on its side like so, and to actually cut it into rings, kind of like you would a melon. Again, it has that hollow core to it, so you got to be kind of careful when you're cutting the last piece. Then once you have it cut into rings, I take 2 rings at a time, and I simply cut like so, turning the ring periodically, so that I end up with cubes that are roughly the same size. Out of that one medium-sized butternut squash, I essentially have a full medium bowl of squash. Now that this is prepped, I'm going to go ahead and set it to the side and work on the next part, which is actually going to be our breadcrumbs. So the breadcrumbs are going to be a vital part of this dish because they're going to add that structural component and also the textural component so that when you bite into the pasta, there's a little bit of crunch. So I prefer to use my own breadcrumbs that I've made myself versus store-bought breadcrumbs. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have made the bread yourself, but as you finish a loaf of bread, if there's an end or a piece that you didn't use, just toss it in your freezer. And then when it's time for this pasta, you can get all those bread pieces out of the freezer, throw them on a sheet pan, much like the one I have over here. And I'm just going to toss this in the oven for about 10 or 15 minutes. It's going to toast up these pieces. It's going to give them a little bit of crispness. And then I'm just going to throw all of this in a blender or a food processor, and voila, you have homemade breadcrumbs. And they are so much better than the kind that you would get at the store. So give these about 10 or 15 minutes in about a 350-degree oven while you prep the rest of your components. Okay, so we have our butternut squash prepped right here. I've gone ahead and cut 3 cloves of garlic. There's another video, you'll see the link to it below on specifically techniques on how to cut garlic, but that's here. I've got my other things prepped, and now I'm ready to actually do my breadcrumbs. So these breadcrumbs have been toasting in the oven about 350 degrees for about 10 or 15 minutes, and they're mostly crisp. And I'm actually going to be using the blender today to show you how to do this. Now again, you could do this in a food processor very easily, but what I'm going to do is just start by throwing in some of my breadcrumbs, about half of a sheet tray or so. You don't want to overwhelm the blender too much. That's good for now. A couple more. And we're going to go ahead and put the blender in place. This is where it gets a little tricky. So if your blender comes with one of these fun little plunger type things, I'm going to actually force the breadcrumbs down until I get the desired consistency. And it's going to get kind of loud, but I'll show you how this process works. So we're going to start by turning it on, speeding it up a little bit, then pushing down. I've got my breadcrumbs. I'm going to go ahead and toss them into a bowl. You want to make sure you get all the breadcrumbs out of there. They're going to still be a little hot from the oven. And they're going to want to gum up, so mix them around with your hands a little bit. And what you're left with are really nice, soft breadcrumbs, not those dry, hard, stale ones that you get at the store. And this will go perfect with the butternut squash pasta that we have going. So now we're ready to actually begin the cooking process. Step 1 is going to be to toast up these breadcrumbs with a little bit of butter, a little bit of olive oil. So I've got my pan. I'm choosing sort of the Le Creuset enameled pan here. I'm going to give it some medium heat. While that's heating up, I'm going to go ahead and cut some butter into pieces. So again, I've got my unsalted butter here, a big 2-pound roll of it. Any butter would work, again, if it's just butter you have in your fridge. I'm going to cut off a piece of that butter, then cut it into some smaller pieces. I'm going to go ahead and throw those in my pan, a couple small pieces of butter, and I'm also going to hit it with a little olive oil. So this isn't just butter, it's butter and olive oil. You want to make sure you're using a good quality olive oil. If you're here in Cincinnati, I highly recommend Cofinas olive oil. They're local in terms of the actual store itself. They're at Findlay Market, and they have wonderful quality olive oil. So I've got some olive oil in here. I've got some butter that's heating up. We're going to get it up to the right temperature, and then we're going to toast some breadcrumbs. So our butter is just about ready. If you look, you see some of the butter solids are turning brown. You see those flecks of brown at the bottom. That's right about the temperature that we want. Some of it is spurting up a little bit. I'm going to take my breadcrumbs, and what I'm going to do is just kind of sprinkle them over the butter. It's kind of fun because you'll see the butter foam up around them. Get them all into the pan. And then we're just going to scoot them around, and we're going to try to get an even coating on all the breadcrumbs of the butter and olive oil mixture. I'm going to turn my fan off so you can hear me a little better. And as we're doing that, I'm also breaking up any of the bigger pieces of bread because we want bread crumbs, not bread chunks. So once I have those moving around, we're not trying to burn these, we want to toast these. I've still got my medium heat going. There's a couple chunks that didn't actually break up, so those go back into my container. And now I'm going to season them. The reason I like to use kosher salt is because its coarseness allows you to spread it without getting too much. So I'm just going to take a little bit of kosher salt and sprinkle it over the breadcrumbs. You don't want too much because this is just a seasoning, but these will add a lot of crisp and also a nice crunch to the actual pasta. The total process of this, once your pan is hot enough, is really only about 2 to 4 minutes. In the pot next to me, I have water that is just about coming to a boil. It's getting there. And when that boils fully, I'm going to add a pinch of salt to that, and then I'm just going to throw in my pasta. All right, it's been about 4, maybe 5 minutes, and I know my breadcrumbs are done by the old taste method. You always have to taste what you're cooking. So I grabbed just a few, and first of all, they didn't feel soft anymore. They had a little bit of a crunch to them between my fingers. Crunch to the teeth, but they're not burnt. Little hint of salt on the back. They're perfect. So I'm going to stir them around a little bit more just to make sure they're all evenly coated. And then all I'm going to do is put them right back into the container that they came from. And then I'm going to get the pasta prepped. I've got that wiped out. I've got the breadcrumbs done. My water is just at that boiling point. So I'm going to take a pinch of salt, and I'm just going to throw in my pasta. You always want to make sure that you're cooking the pasta according to the package instructions. This one says for 10 minutes. So I'm going to toss it in there. For the recipe that we're making, you're going to want a full pound of pasta. So throw the whole thing in there. You're going to stir it around a little bit, and you're going to set your timer. While that's getting started, it's now time for my butternut squash. The butternut squash is where you definitely want to see that brown butter component. So I've got my butter over here. I'm going to go ahead and cut up the butter into pieces. And I'm going to be using, for this particular recipe, about 6 tablespoons of butter. The pan's nice and hot, so the butter is going to brown up very quickly. And I'm going to throw in some olive oil, just so there's a nice blend. You're going to get lots of butter splatter here, but that's okay. It's going to seem like a lot of butter, but you've got a lot of butternut squash. And what better to go with butternut squash than butter itself? So I'm going to go until it's getting to that browning point. Let me hold it up so you can see. What's happening now is the foam. You don't want to throw your food in while it's foaming. The foam will subside. And when it subsides, you will have a nice, even layer of brown butter. Same as I did with the breadcrumbs. I'm going to pour my squash in, and I want to do this carefully so I don't spill the butter or splash. Again, it's a lot of butternut squash. And it's going to be imperative for this to cook down all the way till it's nice and soft, but not mushy. I'm going to season it with some salt, about 2 pinches. I've also got about a half teaspoon of crushed black pepper. I'm going to throw that in there with maybe a third little pinch of salt. Now I want to take my spatula and work it all the way around, getting everything incorporated. You want it to evenly cook, which is why it's also important to have a nice saucepan or saute pan or whatever it is you're using. Move it around, and then you can crank up your heat a little bit just above medium. Once everything is nice and coated, you just have to stir it periodically and wait for your pasta to finish. So our butternut squash is done. It's soft but not too mushy yet. And I'm going to put it back into a container. Because it's so hot, I'm going to put it into a glass bowl this time. So I'm going to kill the heat, put it in here. Careful not to lose too much of it to the sides. And then this is going to go right back onto the burner so that we can get our garlic and our sage toasted up. And then everything will be ready to plate. So now it's time for the last component of this dish. So to pair really nicely with the butternut squash, we've got some sage, we've got 3 cloves of garlic, a pinch of thyme, and I've got my brown butter going on here. So I'm going to take this and stir it up in here. Not long at all. I'm just going for maybe about 35, 45 seconds. I'm going to go ahead and toss the pasta back in. And I'm going to work it around, trying to get all of the butter incorporated into the pasta. Once I have that all worked in, I'm going to do about half of the breadcrumbs. Mix those around. Then I'm going to pour in our butternut squash. It's going to get a little hard to begin mixing everything together at this point. But the key is just to incorporate it as well as you can. Mixing the components together so that everything is flavorful.